name is Richard Salva, and I'm the author of a book titled The Reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln. The inspiration for writing this book came to me about a dozen years ago. I was on an airplane flight flying cross country, and I was in between writing projects. And as a yogi, a minister, a spiritual person, I thought I would ask God, ask the universe for an inspiration, for guidance on something to work on. So I sat on that airplane with my eyes closed, and I just sent up a prayer to the universe for guidance, for inspiration. And it's amazing because within less than a minute's time, the idea for this book came to me. And it wasn't a vague sort of notion at all, it was a very strong thought. If I could put the thought into words, it would be, you remember what you had read about what Yogananda had said about Abraham Lincoln, having been an advanced Himalayan yogi in a past life, and having been reborn as Charles Lindbergh. Why don't you investigate this? Why don't you study it? Why don't you go into the history books and see what can be found? See if there is any evidence to support what Yogananda had said. And so I decided to do this, and the more I thought about it, the more excited I became. And at the beginning of the process, it ended up taking me about 8 years or so to do all the research, because there's a lot written about both men. And I was very excited about the idea of working on this, because here were two men whose lives had been so deeply chronicled, that if there were evidence of reincarnation between them, it should be possible for me to find it. In addition to that, I had already been spending, at that period of time, more than 20 years studying on a daily basis and practicing meditation and the other teachings of Himalayan yogis. And so I knew also, though, that it would be possible for me to find in both the lives of Lincoln and Lindbergh any evidence that they had been a Himalayan yogi in a past life. So I started to work on this project, and again, at the very beginning, I wasn't sure what I would find. I thought I might find a few interesting connections, but I was just blown away by both the quality and quantity of evidence there was of connections, similarities between the two men. I mean, it was just amazing, much more than I had dreamed of. As I said, I thought maybe I'd find a few connections, but I ended up uncovering nearly 500 fascinating similarities between Lincoln and Lindbergh, more than 200 connections between the habitual words and actions of Abraham Lincoln and the ancient spiritual science of yoga, and more than 100 connections between Charles Lindbergh and the path of yoga. And these connections between Lincoln and Lindbergh aren't the same sort of connections that we all share. For instance, you and I might both like pizza and music by the Beatles, or these sort of things, but they were mental obsessions, physical habits, sense of humor, social preferences. It even went into spiritual traits. Basically, I discovered that in any way that you would define an individual, I found a connection between Abraham Lincoln and Charles Lindbergh. I mean, it was just overwhelming of what there was to discover. And I didn't put everything I had found into my book either. I put the things that I thought were the best. If I had two connections that were very similar, I put the one that I thought was better than the other one in the book. So I actually discovered more than 500 connections, but like I said, I wanted the book to represent the best of what I had found. And so it was just really, really quite fascinating to have worked on this book and to find all these connections. And here I thought, after all this work that I had done, here was a real historical evidence that reincarnation is real. In the pages of history, we can find evidence for reincarnation if we know where to look. I knew that since this statement was made by a great spiritual teacher, a great spiritual master, a great master of yoga, a great world teacher like Yogananda, that it was worth checking up on. Another interesting thing about it is that many of these connections hadn't even come into pass when Yogananda had made that statement. because he made it quite a while ago when Lindbergh was in the middle of his life. And so there are many things that happened after he made the statement that also helped to verify what he had said. And Yogananda was a great man of God, and he knew things that most people couldn't know. For instance, when he first came to America in 1920, he was in Boston, and he was teaching the deeper teachings of yoga, but he was also talking about the unity of world religions. He was talking about the divinity of Christ. And somebody sent him a letter, and the person left the letter unsigned and with no address, criticizing Yogananda for what this person called sponsoring Jesus in the West. And this letter writer said that Jesus was just a myth invented to deceive people. And so Yogananda went into a deep state of meditation, and he prayed to be guided to this person. And about a week later, Yogananda had entered the Boston Public Library, and he saw a man seated beneath the window in the corner. And Yogananda went up to the man, sat next to him, and he turned to him and said, "Why did you write me that letter?" And this man almost jumped, and he said, "Well, what letter?" And Yogananda said, "The one in which you said that Jesus Christ was a myth." And this man was just simply astonished, and he said, "How in the world could you possibly know that I wrote you that letter?" And Yogananda said, "Well, I have my ways, but I wanted you to know that the same power that helps me to know who wrote me that letter, that you had written me that letter, also tells me that Jesus did live, and that he was everything the Bible said. He was a great master. He was a true Christ." So when someone like this, someone like Yogananda, who's much more psychic than any psychic, someone who's so advanced spiritually that they would know things that people are thinking, that they, which he proved over and over again in his life. When someone like this makes a statement about a past life, it's enough for us to stand up and take notice. And I think in this book, I really feel that I'm able to show not only the connections between Abraham Lincoln and Charles Lindbergh, but the connections that we have, you and I have, with our own past lives. Because this book isn't about Lincoln and Lindbergh, it's about you and I. It's about what happens to all of us when we reincarnate. What do we take with us? What do we leave behind? Do we continue to do the same thing from lifetime to lifetime, or do we change our interests? Many of these sort of questions are answered in this book, and the book is really quite enjoyable to read because it's written in story format. And I would take a story about Abraham Lincoln that describes a certain quality or a habit or trait or so on. And then right afterward I would pair it with another story, a very brief anecdote from the life of Charles Lindbergh. And then through reading the two anecdotes, you can see, oh yes, there's that interesting connection. They both did this in this particular situation. And sometimes the situations were so exact, and their response just from their gut response, their instinctual response was so exactly the same that it was really quite flooring to work on.